Welcome, everybody. It's time once again for the next chapter with Charlie Hedges as he explores turning the page on his life and yours. Hey, Charlie.
Well, Paul, tell me, are we in mourning today or are we in celebration?
Is that a question?
That is a real question because to make our audience aware, today is the last show in the studio because next week we will record from brand new digs. But I've got to admit that after more than 3 years, I've grown quite fond
of this little cramped space,
cozy little tad bit cluttered studio.
We're moving to UCI, the University of California Irvine's new Applied Innovation Center. It's kind of the mini Silicon Valley here for Orange County, California, and they built us a studio there to tell their story and the community business stories we've been doing over the last 10 years. So we're excited, but yes, a little sad to be moving out of our little clubhouse here.
Yeah, but it's going to be great fun. I'm always up for a change. And speaking of change, my guest today, author, speaker, entrepreneur Linda Olsen, is going to walk us through a process of transforming our lives through story. And that has to do with being stuck in the past to becoming vibrant today and in the future. And boy, does Linda have a personal experience to support her story, but we'll get into Linda's story very shortly. Speaking of story, Linda Olsen is a highly accomplished expert at helping others master their own story and then teaching them how to tell that story to other people. The primary focus of her business is all about storytelling. You know, truthfully, it was Linda's fabulous Tedx talk on YouTube that convinced me. I just had to see if I could get her on the show, and we are so fortunate that she agreed. Before we bring Linda on the air, here's just a bit about our guest today. Linda Olsen is a best-selling author, TEDx speaker, founder of Wealth, and CEO of Wealth Through Stories. As a former college dean and marriage and family therapist, Linda brings us deep knowledge of personal transformation through the telling of your story. In fact, her brand new book, Transform Your Story, and check out this subtitle, Letting Go of the Past When It Won't Let Go of You. I love that. This book offers a step-by-step process to move you from your story to your vision and then on to a renewed and transformed life. With that said, let's bring on Linda Olsen. Linda Olsen, welcome to the next chapter with Charlie.
Oh, thank you so much.
It's such a pleasure to have you with us. And as the audience too knows, I usually chat with my guest a little time beforehand, and we had such a delightful chat a couple of days ago that I really look forward to this podcast.
Oh, and that works both ways. Likewise.
Thank you. You know, Linda, I have a couple directions that I'd like to pursue today, but then one never really knows what direction we're going to go because we are so conversational, yet we kind of headed somewhat of a direction. Still, what I hope to talk about today is the power of story and then your proven strategies for self-forgiveness and how we might move on from the past. So let's begin with the power of story. Linda, I'm going to jump right into it. Of all things, why story? Obviously, you believe there is power in story.
There's a lot of power in story, and there are so many benefits of story, but there's three that really stand out to me. One is story is the number one way to connect with people when they're told well, when stories are told well. They're also the number one way to influence, impact, and transform lives. And story is the way people get to experience us, and it's how we get to experience them through exchanging stories.
I love that. And you can see the success of what you're talking about when you look at podcasts like The Moth, and it's just, individual stories from regular people. They're not professionals, and they're so engaging, and everybody has some little interesting story that they've worked on, and they tell very proficiently. Do you like that podcast, or have you heard it?
To tell you the truth, I'm not familiar with it.
Oh, you would love The Moth. It's you might want to check that out. It just has individual life stories that these people tell. Very interesting, very well. They're very well written, very well spoken, and it ranges from high school students to middle-aged people, and I've not heard older than that, but I'm sure there are. But as we talk about stories, story didn't come as an accident to you, did it? Or maybe it did come as an accident.
Well,
that's really a double entendre. Depends on how you say it.
Depends on the perspective.
Yeah, why don't can you tell us a bit about your story so we can understand more about you, and also we can understand the power of story?
Oh, certainly. My story goes way back to when I was 14 years of age. I grew up on a farm in Midwest Canada, and through a tractor accident, my precious 2-year-old brother was killed. I was the one driving the tractor.
Oh, my.
So you can probably just imagine, here I was, pretty innocent young farm girl. Life was good. But, when those tragedies hit, it's like your whole world just stops. And I really had no idea how to pick up and keep going. But you do the best you can, and it's putting one foot in front of the other and facing every fear, facing the loneliness, facing the shame, facing the guilt. And so after many years, many years, I came to complete healing. And it was at that point, for some reason, that story just became really important to me. Because just prior to that, if somebody had asked me, what's your story, I probably would have said, I don't think I have one. And for some reason, everything changed at that point when I found complete healing. And I started looking around and asking questions, and I thought, if story is so important, why aren't we all sharing our stories every day? And I did some research with that and discovered there were 3 top reasons. One is most people don't think they have a story. Secondly, at least not one that, others would be interested in hearing. And thirdly, if they could come up with something, they would have no idea how to share their story.
One thing about your story, I would like to kind of go back to your story a little bit.
Sure.
And pursue, and as I think at the time that it happened to you, I just hardly can think of a worse time than adolescence. You're already in that stew and already in that crucible of, not knowing who you are, what you're doing, peer influence, less parents' influence, parental influence, and then you are just enter into a life of chaos, catastrophe, shame, guilt. How did you deal with it in those years, Linda?
Well, and I agree with you. I probably couldn't think of a worse or more vulnerable time. It was my first month in high school, and I'll take you way back. I actually attended, now this is really going to age me, but I actually attended a one-room classroom, 8 grades, 30 students, and in fact it was the same school that my dad attended many years earlier. And so
you were in rural.
Yeah, it was. The little house on the prairies?
Yeah.
That's exactly where I was, a little house on the prairies.
Amazing.
So there we were, 30 students for 8 grades. Now, this was my first month in high school, and there were 75 students in the 9th grade. And so it was a very big transition. That was also the year all the country schools consolidated and everybody was bussed into town. But So here I was already feeling very insecure coming in. I was pretty shy and inhibited at that time. And now to have, this unbelievable bomb come crashing on me, it's really, what do you do? And go ahead.
It was just, how did you even make it to school? How did you get out of bed in the mornings?
Well, you know what? And that was my biggest step I took. My dad came the very next morning. I remember so clearly. My dad came to the bedroom door, and I was lying in bed and crying, and he said, "You've got to get up. We have to keep going." And I thought, why? Why get up? My whole world had fallen apart. But, of course, it wasn't only my world that had fallen apart. The world had fallen apart for my parents and my siblings as well. And somehow I made myself just get out of bed. I mean, it was really the toughest thing I did that day and for many days and weeks and months to come. And, you go to the breakfast table and you sit there, and communication already wasn't that good in our family, but we got to the breakfast table, and the only word spoken was, "Pass me the jam." And, it was just quiet. Everybody had basically withdrawn and, hold our feelings in. And the toughest thing was there was nobody there in this little community that understood grief. They didn't understand that it was so important to talk about your pain. It wasn't that they weren't supportive. They were there, and they would bring us meals. Of course, nobody felt like eating. But, they did what they could, but they didn't understand that what I needed more than anything was just someone to talk to.
It said, is it that, not having been there, but just have read about it, is it that sort of stalwart Midwest farmers, ranchers, gumption to just persevere no matter what, and not show emotion, just get the job done, and go home and eat and go to bed and get up in the morning and do it the next day, without ever confronting, like you said, anything of grief or anything having to do with emotion or anything having to do with any kind of internal conflict. Is that kind of typical in the Midwest in those days?
It really is. And then on top of that, I don't know if you know anything about the Mennonite culture.
A little bit.
If you go way back, they kind of take you way back to the Amish, where basically,
right.
They have a wonderful, hardworking, loyal culture, but the weakness is that they repress emotions, and so that was on top of, kind of that strong, persevering, workaholic character traits that are often, particularly in the farming community in the Midwest. And so at that point, of course, those traits felt like a weakness.
Yeah, and they really can't afford it because you have a weak year of crops, you're out for a year, so you just can't afford to have adversity get in the way of your, I hate to say productivity, but not in the way we think of it in business culture today, but we're talking crops and crop failures and crop successes, and you've got to get up in the morning and milk the cows and tend the fields. I mean, there is no option that I'm going to take a day off today. I think I'll ponder my psyche today.
You're absolutely right. You just get up and you do it. And that was certainly the approach that, my dad particularly took. But many years later, when I look back at that, I thought, you know what? It was like he was handing me this torch of courage and strength, courage just to get up out of bed and strength to face whatever lay ahead. And so those traits were really what kept me going at that time, and that perseverance is really what has brought me to where I am today.
Isn't that wonderful? What that right away in our current society, we want to go right down deep and go into the core and the kernel of the psychological aspects of it, when perhaps there just needs to be a respite from that, and some sort of form of security and some sort of form of ritual or routine that we get into that helps us in the grieving process. It, I know therapists today would call it denial, but it seems to me that it could be more of a foundation setting where we can deal with it later on and still have a strong foundation underneath that can prop us up. Does that make any sense?
Absolutely, it does. That's the only thing my parents knew, because that's what they grew up with.
Of course.
And, you just got to keep going. You got to pursue it. I mean, the sad part for me was that my parents never got to a place where they could really find that emotional healing from their pain. I was very fortunate, because as I went on to higher education and training and so forth, that I was able to get professional help to deal with that. But basically back there in this small community, at the time, there were no support groups, there was no counseling, there wasn't anything available. There is now, and I'm pleased to say that my brother, who is 3 years younger than I am, that he had many years later pursued some of that help for himself. But unfortunately, my parents were also of a mindset that, you just keep going, and that emotional part is really not that important.
You forged your way through. That was, I think, how long was that part of the American culture? Until, look at, even in, you go post-60s, you go 70s, 80s, even psychotherapy was frowned upon, and people were really reticent to admit that they were going to therapy, because that was some form of weakness. And how dare you have that form of weakness when it's melting our lives. It's so destructive. What was it that caused you? Now, I know you were a college dean, and you were a college, and you were responsible for a lot of the women on college, in college, and so you had there's a female. Fortunately, females are more adept at emotional wherewithal than males are. So you had that. Then you went to marriage and family counseling, and where did you finally discover you had unresolved issues that you had to overcome?
Well, it was interesting, because I did have the opportunity to be a college dean working at a private school in Canada, and at one point, my boss sat me down and he said, if you want to stay in the counseling field, you need to get at least a master's in counseling. And higher education wasn't important to me. It wasn't important to my family. And for me to just get my undergraduate, I thought I had done really well. And so that was a big, big step. But it was what brought me from Canada to the United States. I moved then to Southern California. There was a private school that was, they were the only ones that had a program that I just felt like this was for me. And it was a small group, and so they could choose very high standards. And as I came in, one of the requirements, because it was a marriage and family therapy program, one of the requirements was that we had to have at least 25 hours of personal therapy and 25 hours of group. And so at that point, I really had kind of the attitude, I guess, that, I'm doing well. I pretty much got my life together, but these are the requirements, so I'll just get them out of the way as quickly as I can. Well, I was in for a very big surprise. And as I asked around and got one particular counselor's name kept coming up over and over. And when I called her, she said, I have a waiting list, but if you're willing to wait, I'd love to work with you. And I said, yes, I am willing to wait. And about a month or two later, she called me. And as I went in to see her and was just kind of briefly sharing, kind of giving her a broad overview of my life, and the accident with my little brother came up, and I made the statement, and I said, I don't think my parents have worked through their pain. And she looked at me and she said, have you? And I said, yes, I think so. And she said, what makes you think so? And I said, well, I'd actually been speaking at many different women's luncheons in the greater Vancouver area, and just the fact that I could talk about it without tears, I thought, certainly that, that ought to mean that I've worked through this. And she made a statement I'll never forget. She said, when you're ready, she said, we'll work on this. I thought, what have I been missing all this time?
Yeah, you didn't even know.
I didn't know. I had buried the guilt so deep. I didn't know, but she picked up on it the very first day.
How long did it take until you reconciled, or till you recognized that you needed to go another step deeper and to shed the guard that was around you and allow your raw, vulnerable self to be exposed? How long did that take?
It was probably 2 or 3 months, and it was interesting.
Oh, that's not bad.
I remember clearly, I watched a movie, and I came in to tell her about the movie, and it was about a boating accident of these 2 young boys, and one of the boys drowned. And so then this other boy was in therapy. And so I came in to tell her about the movie I had just seen, and she says, you're ready to work on this, aren't you? And I said, I think I am.
How long did that take, Linda? I mean, it's a lifelong process. I understand that, but how long did you take till you felt that you had a breakthrough, an emotional breakthrough, where you were able to access and envision the guilt and the shame and how that was impacting your life?
Well, when I got to that place and she said, you're ready to work on it, I said, I think so. So I believe it was that very session that she walked me through in slow motion that horrible, horrible day. And I sobbed from such depth I didn't know if I'd ever recover. And when the session was over, she said, I don't want you to drive home like this. I have a separate waiting room. I'd like you to wait there until you're ready to drive home. And so as I waited there and finally calmed down, it was like I heard this little voice in my head, and it was like I was having a conversation in my head. And the voice said, has God forgiven you? And I said, yes, he has. And then it said, have your parents forgiven you? And I said, I believe they have. And the next statement was, what keeps you from forgiving yourself? And I didn't have an answer.
Do you now?
Yes, and then as I thought about that, and finally I got on my knees, and I thought, with God as my witness, I said, help me forgive myself, And when I got up, there was such a huge emotional load lifted. I didn't drive home that day. I flew home.
Really? Just in what that it is just, and it's amazing. Sometimes, it takes a long time for the therapy to really, become a part of us. But there is that aha moment where you go, "Holy cow! I never realized this. I never understood this." And it's just, and it is so enlightening, so refreshing, and so comforting. And yet, at the same time, ironically, it's immensely disturbing.
Well, yes, it is. I agree. It's like, wow, I don't know how long I thought about that later, and I thought, part of it was, and this was 15 years after the accident. But at that point, I think, the person just has to be ready. And fortunately, I had a very sensitive and discerning therapist who really had a lot of insight into me, and she knew I was ready. And then that all came in one session. Just huge breakthrough.
You just never know how that works. I had an experience of my own that's totally dissimilar from yours, and that my audience knows I had a troubled childhood, but then I was adopted, troubled childhood until 7 years old, and I was adopted by a goddess who showed me love, boundaries, just truly unconditional love, and just changed my life. I mean, I from where I came from, I would have probably been an incarcerated drug addict or alcoholic, and even from 7, it was just obvious that would happen. And this woman changed my life. And then at 40 years old, when I was 40, she died, and it was God died for me, Linda. I mean, she was my imago Dei. She was my image of God, and she died. And I was talking to a therapist from your same school, and I don't know if you know his name. His name is Henry Cloud. And,
oh yes.
And Henry was just working on his PhD. We were together in the early days, and as I told him that, he said, "You know what his words were to me, Linda?" He said, "Charlie, you're sad." And how many therapists you ever hear use that word? "Charlie, you're sad. You really need to talk to somebody." So he assigned me his and his buddy John Townsend. They assigned me their personal therapist, and the guy's name was Phil Sutherland. And he was a miracle worker. I mean, he turned my life in 20 years. I mean, I did 20 years of therapy with him, and I continue to do therapy now. I did therapy with him, and my life was completely changed, because there were parts of my past that I was ashamed of, embarrassed of, felt abandonment and rejection, and I could never really go into those. And I had bouts of depression without knowing they were depression, yet it was just in a few sessions with Phil and with Henry. Henry and I were really good friends at the time. And Henry really, was a strong impetus in my life. And so I do understand that. Now, one thing you said that I kind of want to move a little bit beyond your story.
And just before you change, let me just say what a small world this is. I was there in graduate school when Henry Cloud and John Townsend and those guys were there, and Phil Sutherland was a professor of mine.
Was he really?
Yes.
I'm telling you, he was by far and away the best therapist I ever had. And you know what his goal after all the therapy, after all the years? You know what his goal in therapy was for me? He finally told me after several years. He said, my only goal, Charlie, was get you to love me. Because once you loved me, I knew you would love yourself and you would love your God.
Wow.
And he had to take me through a whole process of that. But he was brilliant. Phil Sutherland was absolutely brilliant.
Yes, he was.
I don't know if you felt that way as a student, but as a therapist, he was amazing. That is interesting. Small world, small world. Now, you also claim that you have this powerful story, but you make this strong claim that all people have their own story, and that story is gold. But I have the feeling that many people listening are thinking just exactly what you said earlier. I don't really even have a story, especially one as dramatic as Linda's. Why would I even begin to try to tell my boring life story?
Well, you're absolutely right on. That is what most people think. And see, I think where we get caught up in this myth is that we have to have this big, life-changing story, or it doesn't count. And that's not true at all, because, as you know, we live in a real broken world today, and everybody has gone through some kind of pain, some kind of significant conflict, or problems that they've had to deal with. And it's not how big the conflict is, it's what we've learned through that conflict that makes up our story.
It's what branded us.
Big traumatic conflict,
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And then we're going to take a break in just a minute, but I do have one question before the break, and that is, what is it about story that seems to bring to surface our deepest hopes as well as our most limiting fears? How does story bring those alive and bring those almost out of our subconscious and into our conscious mind, our conscious thinking? Because these troubles live in our subconscious or our unconscious, and we rarely have access to them. But story seems to give us a window to access those. What do you think it is about story that does that?
Story is basically sharing an experience. But when it comes to sharing our pain, I really believe it's the vulnerability, being willing to be vulnerable. And that's often a scary place to go because, there's always a risk when we're vulnerable, whether, people will accept or reject us. But when we're willing to go to that place, to share from a vulnerable place, there's something about that deeper connection that makes all the difference. And it's like when I'm willing to share from a vulnerable place, it's like giving someone else permission to be able to share as well. And if you're with a group of people and you watch this happen, somebody shares from a vulnerable place, and all of a sudden everybody's got a story to share.
Isn't that the truth? That is, because it's almost like it gives everybody permission, and it gives permission, but it also reminds me, oh yeah, I guess I do have a story, and I never thought of it as that, but I do have a story that needs to be explored. Well, what I want to talk about after our break, we're going to take a break, and what I want to talk about is these limiting stories that hold us back, and you really offer some what I think are really sound and quite insightful methodologies for self-forgiveness and through the power of story. And I would like to explore that after our break. But right now we'll take just a quick break, Linda.
Okay.
Hi, you're listening to The Next Chapter with Charlie, and this is Charlie Hedges with my guest Linda Olsen, the storyteller extraordinaire, and we're pondering the issues of how story is life-giving and how story tells who we are on the inside, the hidden parts of our inside, the parts that we don't want to look at, or even sometimes, Linda, we didn't talk about the story, the parts of our stories that we really praise, but out of this fear of being prideful, we don't even want to bring those out. But there are good stories that we hide within ourselves as well. Now, it seems to me that when we tell truthful stories, frequently we're forced to face aspects of our past that we really don't like to face, such as your so troubling story. From the research I did on the show, I did on you for the show, I see that you have developed a process for dealing with self-forgiveness, and you've offered a simple, albeit painful process for venturing into the waters of self-forgiveness. Would you like to share that 3-step process with us?
Oh, certainly. Well, after many years of walking through my own pain, and as I look back, I thought, I recognized there was a pattern, a process that every time these negative emotions would rise, whether it didn't matter what they were. It could be fear, it could be guilt, loneliness, shame, whatever it was. But every time they rose, I had to stop and identify what it was I was dealing with. And once I could identify it, now I had the option and the freedom to address it.
Can we stop just right there real quickly? Because I think this is, as you said, the first step, but I think it's an essential step. Until you can identify that, you really don't have a chance. Until you can, I think maybe you were going to say it later, but I know you used the word name it. Until you can name it, you can't deal with it.
Well, that's exactly right, and that's why even when I was in denial for so many years with my guilt, it wasn't until my therapist named it and it blew me away, because I had no idea, that had never come to mind that I needed to deal with that in 15 years.
No kidding. No kidding. Just your therapist was, sounds like you had a good therapist.
Oh, she was remarkable, absolutely exceptional.
Probably another friend of mine, which we're not going to mention her name, but it sounds like all the people you went to school with I knew.
Yes, so then from there, once you can name it and identify it, like I said, then
what did you name? Can you tell us what you named your demon?
Well, that would vary. That often it was fear. Guilt, however, was the number one demon for me because of my situation. But like I said, fear was right behind that. And you know what? When these things come up, it's like fear. Fear never walks alone. It always brings with us insecurity and self-doubt and so many other things. But if you can identify kind of that number one negative emotion that's facing you at that time.
Oh, and I don't want to go off track, but I will just make the side statement that I think that is a problem with our country today on both divides. It's fear on both sides. One is fear of protection. They don't want to lose what they have. And the other fear is not having what they need. And so you have these two fears that are incompatible fears that can only end up in unrest. But I think fear is just a major driver in the human psyche.
Well, it is, and the thing is, fear is also disguised in many ways. Stress today is just the modern word for fear. And if you can talk to almost any medical doctor, and they will tell you that 85% of illnesses today are stress-related. And that's really fear. It's also disguised with, procrastination and overwhelm. You'll hear many people, and I will use those words all the time too. You feel overwhelmed, and because I know that the root of that is fear, when I face that, I just stop and ask myself, what is it? What's the fear that's coming up for me right now? And again, when I can name it and identify it, then I have the choice to address it.
Yeah, and too often that fear, the stress from that fear, is for inappropriate or inadequate or not healthy goals, not healthy quests that we're shooting for something that we really can't ever attain. And so there's always going to be stress on it, and we're comparing ourselves with others, and others are comparing ourselves, and it's just this scorekeeping game that is just a downward spiral.
Absolutely. And all stress isn't bad. We need a certain amount of stress to meet deadlines and, that kind of thing.
Great point.
But it's often what comes along with that.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so you name your fear. Mm-hmm. Or you name, I like to call it the beast. You name your beast.
Yes. And then you need to make a choice. What are you going to do with this negative emotion that's in front of you? Are you going to avoid it, run from it, try and escape it some way, and we all have our own ways to try and do that, or are you going to face it? So it's always a choice. But at the same time, just because, even if you say, well, I'm going to face it, but just saying it isn't enough, because thirdly, you have to take the action. You can have the greatest intentions in the world, but until you take action, nothing changes.
Give me that little metaphor that you told me that I just thought was so powerful regarding facing or running from your fear.
Oh, well, it's kind of interesting. Where I live, just over the hill, are some beautiful ranches. There's cattle ranches, horse ranches, even a buffalo ranch. And having grown up on the farm, of course, I knew a lot about cattle. And cattle, as many people know, that they are not known for their speed. They're actually very slow runners. But when a storm comes, and they will sense the storm coming, pick up their heads, and start running in the same direction the storm is headed. Therefore, prolong the storm.
Yeah, so they're running with the storm, not against the storm.
Exactly. Buffalo, on the other hand, they too will sense the storm coming, and they will face the storm and get through it much more quickly. And so we always have that choice. Are we going to prolong whatever it is that is in front of us, or are we going to face it and we'll get through it much more quickly?
Linda, I love that metaphor because, how many times do we say the way to healing is through it, not around it? And we casually throw that out, but this little buffalo metaphor is that we need to be buffaloes. We need to just, okay, come on, bring it on, give me your best, and I will deal with it, and it will be over, rather than just letting it prolong itself for months or years or even decades.
It was kind of cute. I had a lady tell me just recently, she said when she heard me share that metaphor, she said, Oh, isn't that funny? She said, growing up, I had a teacher that would always tell me, "Oh, you are just like a buffalo." And she thought it was something negative. And when she heard my story, she was so excited because she realized it was really positive.
And how many years had she lived thinking she was put down? Said, "Oh, my goodness." That. So let's just go through the steps really quickly. It's name your enemy, name your fear, name your beast. Secondly, is make a choice. Are you going to run from it, or really better? It's not so much running from it; it's stuffing it, and just putting it down. Or are you going to say, "All right, I'm going to have to face this thing. It's going to be ugly. It's not going to be pretty." But the result will be in health. What's the third step? What's the third step on this?
And that third step is just taking the action to actually do it, to follow through.
And what kinds of actions might those be?
It depends on the situation, the circumstance. If it's conflict with could be a family member, could be a coworker, professor. Whoever it is, but just often it's just having that conversation and talking to them and letting them know if you're coming from a place of hurt or of pain or disagreement, that sometimes we have to agree to disagree to be able to move on, but that is still much better than dissolving the relationship. And sometimes it's just a matter of hearing a perspective, and as long as we're willing to come from a place of a humble heart and be able to listen to someone else, most of those things can be resolved.
But then on occasion, it is appropriate to resolve to end the relationship or to cut back on the relationship because it's only going to be negative. It's only going to produce pain and more fear and more anger and more vitriol. And sometimes it's better to say, "God bless you, I love you. You ever need anything, that's great, but I think it's probably best that we sort of separate our ways a little bit." Would you agree with that?
I would agree with that. But at the same time, it still brings closure to this. So rather than just avoiding it all, we're having that conversation to bring closure.
Yes. I've been blessed with something. Maybe, everything is history of experience, but I've been blessed with, I detest conflict, but I do not avoid it because I found that conflict is the route to healing, that we have to deal with it. Just get in there, talk about it, but talk about it with kindness, not talk about it with anger, not talk about it with accusations or insults, but say, "I've kind of felt this when you say this. What do you think?" Try to be as you, and maybe we could talk just a bit about courageous conversations, but having a courageous conversation about that is really helpful. I've often, when I was a consultant, when I was in facilitators, I was called in to facilitate conflict among high-level groups. I mean, like groups that were running multi-million-dollar organizations, and high levels wouldn't even talk to each other. And I could get, as a facilitator, I would not get involved in the conflict. I wouldn't get enraptured with it. And so I could see it from the outside, and I could present a perspective that was quite different. So that's, I count that as a blessing. I think that's unusual, but it doesn't mean I don't avoid all conflict. All conflict I deal with. I can be the avoider with the best of them.
Well, I think it happens to all of us, but yes, I agree. If you can get to the place, because most of the time it's not even so much that outer conflict, it's the inner conflict, within us. If we can address that and just look at it, sometimes for me it's asking, what's the worst thing that could happen? if it's a close relationship, I would be devastated to lose that relationship. But at the same time, if it's a friendship, I have to remember that this friend means enough to me that I'm willing to take that risk in, just addressing the situation at hand.
I so agree. Let's briefly. We're kind of wrapping up now, but I do think there is a word that I mentioned that's something that we've talked about that I find interesting. And what is it you mean by courageous conversations? I think that's the name, the alliteration just kind of rings a bell to me, and I think there's something to it. How would you define courageous conversations?
Well, as we were talking about conflict, it really is tied in very closely to that, because it is having that courageous conversation. It may be with ourselves, it may be with others, but it's really having that conversation, that almost what comes to mind is tough love conversation, that I care enough about the situation, about the person, that I am willing to take that risk, and so that I can address and deal with this.
And courageous conversations to me too has to do with humility, kindness, and largely assuming my responsibility in this conflict, because it is rarely, if ever, one way that we in AA say, we've got to keep our side of the street clean. And that's what the 9th step is all about, when going to people that we've wronged and telling them that we've wronged them and ask forgiveness, because trying to clean up our side of the street, that way we can feel good about ourselves. If somebody else doesn't accept it, we just have to go with it. But there is something that's really powerful about admitting our responsibility into it that gives the other person freedom to perhaps be a bit more vulnerable, do you think?
Absolutely. And to me, I often refer to that phrase, owning your story. I love the quote that Brene Brown says. She has many wonderful quotes, but one particular one stands out to me. Owning your story and loving yourself in the process is the bravest thing we will ever do. And that certainly was for me.
I agree. Okay, I've got one final question that will not take long. I am going to post on the show notes. I will post your website. I will post a link to your TEDx talks that I would encourage people to listen to. And I will also do a link to the Amazon to get your book, Transform Your Story, Letting Go of the Past When It Won't Let Go of You, so they will be able to get that. But there's something in your website that I noticed that I would like you to close this out with. And in your website, at the bottom of the page, you have these opportunities, and I believe they're free. They're for 5-day challenges that help you identify your story and how you can create your vision and how you can create your way through. Can you explain what those are about and how they would be helpful to people?
Oh, yes, I'd be happy to. It's something actually I've only started in the last few months, but I find they're a great way to get a lot of valuable input and a great way to engage with someone. And what they are, they're basically 5 days of 1 hour. I do them through Zoom calls, 1 hour Zoom trainings each day. And we follow a particular theme. Like one that I did last month was to create a transformational story. So going from not even sure if you have a story to knowing how to create a transformational story. My next one coming up in August now is going to be to share your story so others will listen. And so each month I am looking at or hoping to put together each month a 5-day challenge. They're a very low fee. Usually I charge like $17, and you're getting 5 hours of solid training, interaction.
Yeah.
And
bang for buck.
Yeah. Really, it's just a fun way to engage, to give a lot of input. I record these, so they're up in the Facebook group, and we just have a great time.
Well, I encourage everyone to get to that. Linda Olsen, thank you so much for spending time with me today.
Oh, it's certainly been my pleasure.
Thank you, and know that I will post all the links to your website, your TEDx talk, your book, so people can have access to that. And as always, I want to thank our listeners for tuning into The Next Chapter with Charlie, and be sure to check us out at our website, thenextchapter.life. And until next, this is Charlie Hedges signing off. Bye for now.